Okay, cool. Let's get started. So I think all or most of the people in the call here know who I am. I see a lot of familiar names and faces, at least in thumbnails. So I'm Josh, Josh Wickman. I am here in New York City, for those of you who are not. And I've been doing HEMA for about 4 years, I think, four and a half years. I also do I do longsword and method. I do Bato as well, and I also have a PhD in physics from the long ago before time, long before swords. So physics is something that I always just kind of have in the back of my mind anytime I am doing anything with sort of mechanical motion, which is, a lot of sword play. So physics is kind of wrapped up in the way I think about swords. So I thought I would share some of those thoughts with you guys today. So the topic for tonight is torque and leverage, which comes into play a lot in bind work. So rotational mechanics, focusing on torque and leverage for tonight. So, oh, that animation didn't work. Here we go. I've got lots of animations here. This is going to be our sword for tonight. I've done all of the graphics in just Google Sheets, so bear with me. You're going to have to maybe use your imagination a little bit to see beyond the rough edges. So what we're actually going to be driving towards tonight is this topic of leverage and what it is, what it means in the context of swords. But to get there, we have to go through kind of a whole bunch of other concepts first. So I'm going to kind of assume that that nobody really remembers any physics from the school, but I'm going to try to keep things mostly conceptual and kind of just at an intuitive level as much as possible. So we're going to start by talking about force, what that is, and it's just kind of at the most fundamental level, and then how forces can cause translational motion, rotational motion, and then we'll talk about torque, which is kind of wrapped up in rotational motion as well. And then there's this thing called a lever arm, and from there, we're going to be able to talk about leverage. So a force is just a push or pull on an object that changes how it moves. It can be any type of change in motion. If you have an object at rest, you can make it start moving by pushing or pulling on it. And if you have something that's already in motion, you can speed it up, you can slow it down, you can change its direction. And this all kind of has to do, which one it is depends on which direction you push in. So force is what we call in physics a vector quantity. So it has both a magnitude and a direction, and the direction is sort of an intrinsic property of that physical quantity. So the direction is important, the magnitude is important, obviously. So the magnitude of a force is just how hard you push or pull. So yeah, that's force is just kind of that's force at its most basic. So when you push on something, the type of motion we usually think of is what's known as translational motion or linear motion, which is just motion from point A to point B. So that what's actually happening is, or the way we usually characterize this in physics is the motion of the object's center of mass, which is the point in space where if you took all of the mass, all of the stuff of the object and concentrated it into one point, that would be the center of mass. Now it can be, for a simple object, it would be inside the object. It doesn't have to be. So like a rod like this, the center of mass if all of the mass is distributed evenly along the rod. The center of mass would just be in the geometrical center. But for if it was heavier at one end than the other, then it would be offset from the center. If you have like a ring or something where all of the mass is concentrated along the edge, then the center of mass would be in the geometrical center of that. But it would actually be outside of the extent of the object. Anyway, the motion of the center of mass is called translational motion. So if something moves from point A to point B and ends up in sort of a different place, so to speak, then that's translational motion. So you can get this by pushing or pulling on an object, exerting a force on the center of mass. And you can also get it by pushing or pulling on different parts of the object at the same time. So if I push right at the center of mass, then it'll move. But if I also push at the top and at the bottom, then it'll also move. You can kind of convince yourself that would be true. So, like I said, the direction of the force matters here. So if I push in a different direction, I'm going to get a different kind of motion. And that's not the next slide. So translational motion of a sword. So that would just be, like I said, point A to point B. So something like this, or if you're in long point, you go at your opponent, or stabbity stab stab, or oops, I dropped my sword. All of those are translational motion. Now, if we take one of those forces from before and flip it around to push the other way, then we're not going to actually necessarily move the object from point A to point B. We're going to rotate it instead. So if I take a rod or a stick, push on the bottom to the right, push on the top to the left, it's going to spin around instead of moving through space. We say that the object is rotating about an axis, and the axis of rotation is a line through space around which everything is rotating. So everything, that's the point that's stationary throughout the rotational motion. So you can think of like a wheel axle. The wheel rotates along, the wheel is spinning, it's spinning around the center of it. There's an axle through the center, and every point along that axle is stationary through that rotational motion. So the rest of the object is rotating around that line through space. And again, this doesn't need to be inside the object. It can be just somewhere in space, and we'll see some examples of that in a little bit. So hopefully this part makes sense. So let's look at some examples of sword rotating. So I've just put some static images here with rotation around different axes of rotation, centers of rotation. That wasn't supposed to happen. Okay, so the first one here, we're rotating about a point around the geometric center of the sword. So you might see this in, say, this could be like the top-down view of this Werkau or something like that. You might see it, you could maybe imagine some other context where you might see this one, although this is probably not as common as some of the others. The middle one here, rotating about a point through the hands. So you can imagine that maybe if you're just kind of like sitting in long point or something like that, and then you do like an Obanagenehmen up and then down, you're rotating it roughly about the hands. Or if you're just sitting there and then you go in for a hand snipe or something, then you're just kind of doing a small motion right at the hands. And then the third one here, the axis of rotation is actually outside of the object. It's kind of behind the pommel here. And this would be any of your hues. So an Oberhau or what have you, you're actually going to be, the sword is going to be rotating about a point outside of the object. Now, the actual motion of a sword is obviously more complicated than this. You're not going to necessarily be swinging in a circular arc. A lot of our classes have talked about swinging a sword in a parabolic arc, actually. So this is overly simplified, but the sort of the real motion is built out of these simpler motions. You can kind of imagine taking multiple types of rotation and combining them into what you would actually see in real life. So now let's move towards talking about torque and what that quantity is. So usually when we're talking about, when we introduce rotational motion in a physics class, we introduce it, we talk about translational motion first, and then we sort of introduce rotational motion in analogy to translational motion, because it tends to be a little bit easier to wrap your head around the concepts, because there are some pretty confusing things in rotational motion. So I'm going to kind of do a brief rundown of that here. Hopefully, this is probably where I'm going to start to lose some of you. Hopefully, this isn't too boring. But so in translational motion, a distance or a displacement is just how far an object is moved. And there's an analog to that in rotational motion too, that we just call angular displacement. So that's how far something has rotated. So I've got a little pie-shaped picture on the left here. You can kind of imagine one of these lines rotating as the object rotates. One of these lines could kind of overlap with the other one. And this green arc here is how far the object has moved. It can be less than one full rotation. It can be more than one full rotation, multiple rotations, things like that. So we also have in linear motion, speed and velocity, how fast the object is moving. And in rotational motion, we've got angular speed and angular velocity. Basically the same concept. It's just now how fast is it rotating rather than how fast is it moving in a straight line. Momentum is the same deal. We maybe don't have as much of an intuitive sense for what momentum is, so I'm kind of going through less and less intuitive quantities here. I describe that here as how hard it is to bring an object to rest. So if something's moving in a straight line, how hard is it to stop it? And you have angular momentum. How hard is it to stop something from rotating when it's rotating, or how hard is it to start it rotating, essentially. So then we've got an analog to mass. This is what I keep clicking on the slide and advancing it, and I should really not do that. So this is where things start to get a little weird and hard to visualize. So in linear motion, the measure of inertia is an object's mass. How hard is it to change the object's motion? So essentially, how much force does it take to accelerate an object a certain amount? There is an analog to that in rotational motion. It's called the moment of inertia. We're not going to talk about that in depth tonight, but I am thinking about making another talk that focuses more heavily on that one. So stay tuned for that. This is how hard it is to change an object's rotational motion. and it can get rather beastly and complicated. So that's why we're not really going to talk about it tonight. But there is an analog. So then following along that logic, torque is the analog to force. So it's kind of a twisting action that you exert on an object to make it rotate. But where things get really confusing here is torque is actually related to linear force. You can't just say, well, torque is the only thing that's involved in rotational motion and there's no force involved. That's not really true. And in fact, all of these linear quantities are in some way wrapped up in rotational motion. Also, it's just a little bit subtle how that actually happens. So torque is essentially the rotational analog of force. It's what you exert on an object in order to make it start rotating, stop rotating, change its rotation, and so on. And you can think of it as a twisting action. So let's dive into some more details of torque itself. So here's the equation for torque. Now, I told you I would keep things conceptual, right? Well, let's just look at this one equation. I promise it won't get, I won't go too into detail here. This is a vector equation, so that's all the arrows mean. We won't have to worry about that, the vector math specifically, but I think this will be a little bit useful to help us understand what is wrapped up in torque and where it comes from and why. So the quantity on the left is that's a Greek tau. Basically looks kind of like a T. That's the torque. Now the F on the right is just the applied force to make the torque happen. So like I said, torque is related to force. That's why it gets a little bit murky in the analogy. But then there's this other quantity too. That's the distance from the axis of rotation to where the force is being applied. So I'm going to go through a bunch of examples here so you can see how this plays out. But suffice to say, it's not only the force that's involved, there's this distance quantity too, and that's going to be important. Now, there is this thing in here too, that's called a vector cross product. Suffice to say that this is going to be the largest when the angle between these two vectors is perpendicular. So there's a different kind of vector product where it's the opposite. It's largest when they're parallel. But essentially, the relative angle between these matters for how much torque we get. So let's take a look at what that looks like in diagrams. Okay, so let's say we've got some object. I'm going to say that this is, a rod or something flat that we're looking from a top-down perspective. And we've got a pivot at one end. And I'm going to say that that's a fixed pivot that won't move. And so that's where our axis of rotation is. Now, if we apply a force to the other end, then this blue arrow here is that distance r. So we're starting at the axis of rotation and going to the point where the force is applied, and we're measuring out like that. Now, so this is kind of like a door swinging, right? So if the axis of rotation is through the door hinge, then I press on the handle, then the distance here, the distance vector is from the hinge measured out to the handle. So what if I instead don't press at the handle? What if I press in the middle of the door? I don't know if anybody has done this and noticed the effect, but if you do, you'll find that it's harder to rotate. So this is why The Hobbit door and the Lord of the Rings with the doorknob in the middle is part of the fantasy because there is a reason why we put doorknobs at the end of the door. Because it's easier to open and close the door that way. So if you try this also and don't press at a perpendicular angle to the plane of the door, then it's also going to be a bit harder to rotate. Remember I said the angle, the relative angle between these vectors matters. And let's take that to the logical extreme. If I press instead at the end of the door, then it's just not going to rotate at all. So you're going to be pressing towards the hinge, and the object is not going to tend to rotate. If this is a perfectly fixed pivot, then nothing's going to happen. But if you press hard enough on a real door, you might break the hinge. So wouldn't recommend it. So breaking this down in terms of the way we usually kind of characterize this and analyze this in physics, we would take a line along the direction of force and then instead measure the distance from the axis of rotation to that line crossing at a right angle. And this is essentially the outcome of that vector cross product. And this distance here is what's known as the lever arm. And that distance is essentially what determines leverage, how much leverage you get out of the force that you're putting in. So, so if I kind of page back here for a second, you can see that this distance here is as long as it can be going to that line of force because it's crossing at a right angle already. But then if this one here, I don't think you can see my mouse cursor. Maybe you can. You can. Cool. So this one here is like what I had on the other slide, so I'll come back to that in a second. This one here, you can see that they're parallel. They will never cross at a right angle, so you're not going to get any leverage out of this. So then this is sort of an intermediate state. And then if you take this lever arm, the magnitude of this lever arm, this distance here, and then multiply it by the magnitude of the force, that's going to be the magnitude of the torque that you get out. So the larger this lever arm, the more torque you're going to get, the more leverage you have. So leverage, I would describe as how much torque you get out of the force that you apply, and that depends on not only where you apply it, but also in what direction. So this is saying for the same amount of force, leverage is how much output torque you get for that input force. So let's talk about swords again, because I know that's why you're all here to begin with. So this should be quite familiar. Everyone who's held a longsword for more than 1 or 2 classes knows that if your opponent exerts a force on the weak of your sword, then it's going to be a little bit difficult to maintain your position, the position of your blade. Now, if that opponent applies the same force at the strong, then it's going to be a lot easier. And the reason is because they're getting more leverage at the weak against your blade than they are at the strong. And so it's easier for them, they get more torque out of that force when they're at your weak. And so it's easier for them to rotate your sword. Now, I'm kind of implicitly putting the pivot at the hands here for simplicity. But then let's take a look at the torque that you're exerting back to resist your opponent when this happens, because you're also exerting a force on your own sword to resist. So the axis of rotation is actually going to be somewhat behind the pommel here, kind of like in the one example that I showed. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. So you're going to need to counteract your opponent's force, downward force here with an upward force. Really need to stop clicking or change my trackpad sensitivity. Anyway, so you're exerting an upward force to counteract your opponent's downward force. And when they're at your weak, you need to exert a stronger force in order to resist their torque and stay in place, assuming the goal is to just keep the same position that you had before. And but you're going to need to exert less force when they're at your strong. So we've all kind of felt this. We know what that feels like in our hands, and so I think that should be familiar. But that's the idea. Your opponent exerts more torque on your sword when they're at your weak rather than when they're at your strong, and so then you need to exert more torque on your own sword back on them in order to resist that motion, to keep from rotating. So I said that the axis of rotation is behind the pommel. How do I actually know that? So if you have an object with a pivot somewhere on it, wow, sorry guys, this is happening very easily. Just trying to move the mouse. You have an object with a pivot somewhere on it. If you exert forces on opposite sides of that pivot, then that will stop it from rotating. So like I'm thinking of like a seesaw or something here, with the pivot fixed in the middle such that it can't. We're not considering translational motion here, which is where I had a very similar diagram on an earlier slide. So that point in the middle is keeping the object from moving in a straight line. And so like if you have a seesaw or something and two people sit on either end, then you can balance it out and keep it from rotating at all. But then if one person hops off, then it's going to, the force from the other person is going to rotate it down. And you can counteract that by, if you wanted to, by exerting an upward force on the same side of the pivot. So if the forces are on opposite sides, then they can be in the same direction to keep the object from rotating. If they're on the same side, then they need to be in opposite directions to keep the object from rotating. So that's what we had here. I knew that we had an upward force from your hands, so I knew that the axis of rotation needed to be behind the pommel. Okay, enough seesaws, back to swords. So let's take a look at just static long point, no opponent, what the forces look like, because you're still exerting forces on your sword to even just hold your sword in long point. And the reason is because there's a gravitational force being exerted on the sword at its center of mass. So you're going to have multiple forces from your hands as well, and those forces are an upward force from your fingers, because you're gripping the sword and supporting it from underneath, but then you've got sort of the heel of your hand pressing down on the handle, and so that's an additional force. You've got multiple forces in different directions from your hands, just to counteract the gravitational force being exerted on your sword at the center of mass, which, by the way, just happens to be the same geometrical location as the point of balance of the sword. That's what the point of balance is, essentially, is the center of mass. Everything is balanced around that point. Okay, let's take a look at what happens if we remove some of these forces, and I think that'll help us to understand what job these forces are doing. So if we remove the force from your fingers, which is to say you kind of just like open up your fingers, you're holding your sword in long point and then you open up your fingers, obviously you're going to drop your sword. And the reason is because you no longer have that upward force. All of the forces you're exerting for an instant are downward. You've got the gravitational force downward, and then for an instant before the sword falls out of your hands, you've got a downward force from the palm of your hands as well. So your sword is going to undergo translational motion downward because all the forces on it are in the same direction. Now, if you only had the force from your fingers, it looks a little bit different. So still got that gravitational force at the point of balance. Now, if you somehow manage to take the palms off of your handle, your grip, but keep your fingers on, then what's going to happen is your sword is going to rotate forward. And the reason that happens is because now you have a downward force and an upward force, but the sword is free to move through space, so it will start rotating about a point roughly around the crossguard. If you don't believe me, you can try it, but I think you can probably imagine that that would be the case. You kind of need to have closed hands with the palm of your hand on the grip as well in order to keep that rotation from happening. So that's why you need both of these forces. The upward forces prevent the translational motion of the sword moving downward under the force of gravity. The downward forces from your palms prevent forward rotational motion. Also from gravity not being exerted like at the axis of rotation. So you need both of these to hold the sword still. If you want to be just hold long point, then you need both the upward force from your fingers and the downward force from your palms. Now, what if we mix and match this? What if you use the upward force of your fingers on your dominant hand and the downward palm force from your non-dominant hand? By which I mean your dominant hand is the forward one towards the crossguard, your non-dominant hand is backward towards the pommel. So what you get there is an upward force. I maybe should have included a diagram here. Sorry about that. You get an upward force next to the crossguard, a downward force next to the pommel, and that kind of seems to work. If you want to try that, you can kind of hold a long point with those forces. But if you do the opposite way, it doesn't work so well. So if you try to put your dominant hand palm and release your fingers on your dominant hand, and then but have your fingers and not your palm on your backhand, your non-dominant hand, then what happens is all of the downward forces are towards the tip, and the only upward force is towards the pommel, and you basically just get rotation the same way you did before, but at a different point. So now the axis of rotation is going to be somewhere between the hands. So you get all downward forces on one side of the axis of rotation, all upward forces on the other side. This was actually kind of neat when I tried it, so I encourage you to try this. Just don't drop your sword, because you'll be sad. Okay, so but this is HEMO. We love pair technique, so let's go back to that. So what about from extension? Can we get more leverage from extension? Well, the reason I asked this question is because I was like, yeah, I've totally experienced this. I've totally gotten more leverage from extending out farther. And then I looked at the geometry of what's happening, and I realized, no, I don't. But then I looked at it closer and I'm like, well, this isn't quite right, is it? So when I say, no, I don't, I mean, I've changed the point at which the swords cross, but they're still crossing at about the same point as each other. So I've gone from weak to weak to like mid to mid, and there's no obvious advantage here. But that's not how this actually plays out, because if you extend the human anatomy is such that you're probably also going to be more upward like that. At least this is what I noticed when I was kind of playing around with this to see why it feels like I get more leverage when I extend. I think this is why. So you're not actually going straight out like this. You're actually going more in that direction if you extend. And if you just hold long point and then you extend, chances are this is basically a thrust. This is an ort. So you will probably find that you do go upward a little, even if you're trying to go straight outward, because of just human anatomy. You're probably going to be more or less at full extension of your arms. And then if you go to full extension, then your arms will rotate up a little bit. And so now in this new position, you can see that you're more towards your own strong than your opponent's strong. So you can get some extra leverage by extending. I do not think this is why we're taught to extend. I think that's mostly for reasons of getting the tip of the sword moving faster, which will be part of what I want to do in the next talk. So we can talk more about that at a later date. But suffice to say, for cutting reasons and so on, that's, I think, really the reason we're taught to extend. But I think we do get a little bit of leverage from extending as well. What about from a height difference? Well, I think any of the shorter folks can tell you that there seems to be a leverage difference due to a height difference. And yeah, there basically is. So all I did here was I just moved the sword upward, and you can see that you're now in the advantageous position, crossing more towards your mid while you're still on your opponent's weak. So I think it seems pretty apparent to me that one of the ways that a taller person has an advantage is a leverage advantage. It does depend on the position, of course, but in long point or in some other similar position, you can get this advantage. What else? Swords aren't perfectly rigid, so that comes into play. Blades will flex; they're made to do that, and they flex more towards the tip. So at the weak of the sword, some of the force from your opponent is going to be absorbed by the flexing, because it's basically just some of the force is going into bending the sword. And so then the torque that you feel from them is going to be reduced. Whereas at the strong, it's more like a rigid object, and so because there's less flex, so the torque is a more faithful representation of the input force. But there's a trade-off here. If you heard that last part about the weak and said, aha, my opponent's at a disadvantage, well, so are you, unfortunately, because your input force is also going to influence your own sword less when there is pressure on your weak. So that's why it feels like you don't have any control at your weak. It's because not only do you have less leverage, but then some of your input force is also going to be absorbed in the flex. It's mostly leverage, but flex does also come into play a little bit. Okay, So why do we care about this? Do you need to know it? Not really. You can definitely do swords without knowing physics. How much of this is actually useful? I don't know, some small amount. How did I get that statistic? I completely made it up. So why are we talking about this? Why? Because, well, I thought it was interesting. I find these things interesting. I thought you might too. And in the end, this is, we do all this for fun. So we should be doing what we're interested in. So I hope that you also found it to be as interesting as I do. So I will wrap up now. So we've got a few takeaways. The biggest one being leverage is the reason why the strong is strong and the weak is weak. Because for the same applied force going in, the torque increases the farther you are from the axis of rotation. That actually, I'm going to skip down to the third bullet here. I didn't actually phrase things this way before, but as someone who is holding a sword, you're generally only holding it at one point, which is the grip, unless you're half sorting or something, which those of you who have done some half sorting will know that that dramatically changes the leverage you have. So assuming that you're only holding it at the grip, then controlling where your opponent's blade is along yours is really important, because that determines how much leverage they have over your blade, and vice versa. If you are able to operate more closer to your strong, then you will have more leverage over them, or closer to their weak is actually probably a bit more salient to an actual sword fight. Grip structure and strength are important too. I will say we looked at the forces that are involved there. I will give it get on my soapbox for just a second and say that the grip structure is more important than the grip strength, but I won't claim that grip strength isn't also important. So end soapbox. And up at bullet 2 here that I skipped, flex is important, but leverage is way more important. And that's why we're even talking about this tonight. That's why I thought to talk about this topic. You can get leverage out of some other effects as well, and not just kind of blade placement, well, it's all blade placement, whatever. But sort of some secondary effects can give you more leverage or less leverage. Extension, it seems to, you seem to be able to get some more leverage out of extending, but that kind of depends on anatomy. It depends on the relative orientation of the blades as well. But with sort of the guards where the grip is lower than the tip, pointing upward, it seems pretty convincing that you would get more leverage with an increase in height. So there are all of these sort of secondary effects, but the main idea is that you get more leverage the farther out from the axis of rotation you are. The axis of rotation tends to be somewhere around the crossguard or farther back. So you want to use this to your advantage, and this is why we parry with our strong against their weak if we possibly can. It's all because of leverage, and you can get there by using feel-in. This is basically what feel-in is. It's feeling out how much leverage you have over your opponent, and it can actually be rather striking how much of a difference there can be in just a small change in positioning along your opponent's blade. So that's all I have. So if you have any questions or want to discuss anything more in detail, we can do that.
I have a thought, if that's something I can share now.
Okay.
I think there's something about your arms being straight that attach them better to your spine. So, like when you're saying the extension gets you more leverage, I think there's a degree of extension that gets you more leverage. And it's one of the reasons why when you're going to try to bind strongly, you either rest your elbows on your rib cage or you extend your elbows to a certain distance. Because there's some weird point where when your arms are bent but not on your elbows are not on your rib cage, you don't have any structure. Because it's something to do with, I think, how well you can tighten the back of your arms, like your triceps through your forearms, and how well attached they are to your spine. So that was a thought that I had when you were talking about why extension gives you better leverage. But if you overextend, that also doesn't work.
Okay.
Discuss?
So yeah, I can see what you're saying. I think I guess what I was mostly concentrating on there was sort of the same input force from you, and then just looking at the relative orientation of the blades and positioning. But I do think that comes into play as well. Essentially, what you're doing if you have, say, your arms resting against your body, is you're bracing your arms with a more structurally sound object, which is grounded and so on. And so you're able to put more force into sort of parrying or what have you. I guess I hadn't really looked at the body elements as much as the sword.
And I think that that's kind of what I agree with you about the linear thing. If your elbows are on your rib cage, you're linear, your arms are linear, but your shoulders don't count anymore because your arms are linear from your elbows on your ribs to your sword handle. But if you take your elbows off your ribs, then your arms are basically 90 degrees
Mm.
until you reach a point where your arms get linear again. And those are the 2 points of structure. When your arms are linear enough in their extension, and then when your arms are linear, when you subtract your shoulders from the equation and just go from your elbows to your sword handle.
Okay, I'd have to think about this some more because I think there are more factors at play here, and it's not just leverage on the sword anymore. It's leverage on your body, and then also I suspect that there are some other elements here that I'm just not really able to think of off the top of my head. So I'll have to think about that some more, like what role skeletal structure plays in sort of in the torque that you're able to exert on your sword.
Joe has some leverage questions in the chat.
Cool. Let's see. Do you think Sharp's biting makes winding more significant because you both pull and push on your opponent's sword? Both pull and push while you're biting? Is that what you're asking, Joe? Okay. So he said yes, for those of you who can't see the chat. I think that there is an element to that, yeah. So because you are able to sort of take more advantage of the force that you're putting in, because it's kind of like if you get a crossguard lock or something, we're used to our blades sliding all over each other as a matter of course since we use blunts. But if the edges bit into each other, then you would be able to kind of move their blade around in different ways, which I think what you're saying is true, Joe, that you're able to kind of manipulate their sword more faithfully to the way that you're moving your own sword. So the torque that you're exerting is a truer translation from the force that you're exerting. If that makes sense. I'm looking at Joe's second question here, which is, does the concept of angular momentum imply that the tip of the sword is vastly more dangerous than the edge? That depends. So if, say, I assume what you're thinking is because the tip is moving faster than the rest of the sword, that means that it can sort of impact harder. Yes, that is sort of nominally true, but there is, I think here, okay, so there's a trade-off there. The tip is moving faster than the rest of the sword, but it also takes the least force to stop it moving because of leverage against the tip. So because it's at the weak, or sort of the extremity of the weak, that distance vector is as long as it can be, and so exerting a force against the tip to stop it will be easier to stop it than exerting a force back against the edge at some other point on the blade. So I actually think that you want those things to kind of be, you want to balance those effects. You want to maximize the speed, but then you also want to have some momentum behind the, or rather, you want to strike with a part of the blade that's not so easy to stop. I think that'll be more apparent after I do the next topic, which is actually I'm going to be focusing on some of those topics a little bit more directly. But yeah, because of it takes less force to stop the blade when the force is exerted farther out. I wouldn't say that the tip is more deadly than the rest of the edge, but I would say that what we think of as the sort of optimal cutting portion of the blade is near the tip for that reason, but you still want to be able to, you still want it a bit farther back so that force exerted against the blade doesn't exert too much leverage on it, or too much torque.
So I want to kind of put this into the hemisphere, or this room sphere. That's really cool what you just said about the fastest part being good until it gets torque on it, like being powerful until it gets torque on it. What do you think about the idea of like the Zornhau having a left step to it means that the tip of your sword lands quickly, but if you meet their sword while moving leftwards, you slide down to your strong while you remain on their weak. So you may meet weak to weak, but you slide down to your strong and you stay on their weak. Does that make some amount of sense? Did I phrase that well?
I guess I don't really know what you're asking, but certainly if when that happens, like if you can manage to sort of transfer, like change the relative orientation of the blade so that their weak is on your strong, then yes, you'll have more leverage, and you'll be able to feel that pretty easily if it's that dramatic when their weak is on your strong.
I think to explain myself better, and I'll try to do this very quickly, it's the difference between having a static Zornhau and a moving Zornhau. So like if you're moving leftward with your Zornhau, you in theory will stay on their weak while you move up to your strong. Where if you have a static Zornhau, you end up meeting weak to weak and sliding strong to strong. And you end up not really gaining anything.
Yeah,
Like,
okay. I see what you're saying. Like, yeah, so yeah, I guess I don't know how to tie that back to the physics in terms of why it would be easier to achieve that state by stepping left. And maybe that's not really the right question to be asking in the sense of like how to tie it back to the physics. But if that's the experience that people have, I'm sure there are reasons for that, and if we dove in, then we could think of some. But if that's the outcome that people observe, then yeah, whatever's more effective in getting their weak on your strong, definitely do that, because that's kind of the name of the game. That's how you gain control over your opponent.
It's because based on the physics, and I'm seeing this in your physics diagrams now. It's because you're moving farther away from them. You're moving farther away from the point of the rotation of their sword. But you're not moving farther away from the point of your own sword. So if like two are standing in front of each other and then you step leftwards, you're technically farther away from the origin point of their sword.
Okay. Yeah, there are a lot of variables there, but I could see how that would be basically equivalent to what you're saying. You're basically equating that to the extension thing. So I could see that being basically equivalent. All right, I see Patrick has his hand up.
I was just wondering if you could imagine situations in where you want leverage less on the tip and close to the center of the sword.
Leverage against your opponent, I assume.
Yes.
Well, I mean, it's all relative positioning, right? So you don't necessarily need to be at the weak or close to the tip in order to have enough leverage to pull off the maneuver you're trying to do. And the closer you are to your strong, the more you can kind of relax that requirement to be at their weak. So if you're right at your strong, then you can totally be more towards their mid, and that should work just fine. I think also I'm kind of thinking of the crew power against the blade as well, which we say like, yeah, you want to do that against the weak, but I think practically speaking, it often falls more towards the mid. And I think that's okay because you're increasing the force that you're putting in. You're really trying to get like a strong strike against their blade in order to beat it out of the way. So that's another way. The distance isn't the only factor in torque. The force is as well. So if you do increase the force, then you will also increase the torque. so that's another thing to keep in mind. But I think that that's situational. There are only some situations where you would practically be able to increase the force enough to make a difference. But I think you were asking more about the positioning. So does that answer your question?
It does.
Cool. Sorry, guys, I'm having a bit of a hard time keeping up with the chat in addition to thinking about answering your questions. So if anybody else has questions, if I have not answered them if they're in the chat or not, please feel free to ask.
Thank you, Josh.
Cool. So I do see some chatter in here about the height difference, but I don't see any questions in there. But it sounds like you guys found that part to be interesting. So, and yeah, the striking pun, that was definitely not intended. Thanks, Harold. And Liliana, if you do have physics questions, yeah, hit me up if you're stumped. Okay, cool. So I guess there aren't any more questions. So we'll leave it here. But if you do think of any more questions or want to talk about anything more afterward, I think most or all of you know where to find me. I'm on the Gemac Discord and various other Discords and so on. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you found it interesting. And if so, then I'll at some point get that other talk together. Joe said something. Not where this video get posted. Oh. Yeah, we'll see. Anyway, okay, that's all I have for you. So I'm gonna end here, and everybody have a good night.